Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the state with the most sarcastic official name in the world, is also the most totalitarian. And if you're cursed enough in the lottery of birth to be born there, you cannot escape it anymore. Obedience to this state and the Kim dynasty that rules it must be absolute. This extends to playing your part in ensuring the country's isolation from the rest of the world. If you disobey and try to save yourself from this totalitarian nightmare, not only are the consequences dire beyond imagination, but managing to escape at all has become almost completely impossible. The regime has tightly sealed off every possible route of escape as of 2024. North Korea is inescapable. Chapter 1. Origins of the Madness. North Korea emerged from brutal Japanese colonialism under the leadership of Kim Il-sung and his guerrillas, who had seen much struggle in their campaign against their oppressors. His armed guerrilla struggle against the Japanese took him not only across Korea, but also in China and the Soviet Union, as he volunteered for the Chinese Communist Party's military wing and then became a full member of the Soviet Red Army. Later, he had the backing of the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP for short, who had unified China under them by 1949. With their support, he launched the failed Korean War to unify Korea under him and his Workers' Party of Korea. The Workers' Party was split along specific ideological lines, according to historian Andrei Lankov. Factions subscribing to Maoism, classical Marxism, or a more democratic approach were opposed to Kim Il-sung's dictatorial style of rule based on his powerful international sponsor, Joseph Stalin. Kim Il-sung and his guerrilla faction had their psyches utterly scarred by years of fighting against an opponent infamous for giving no quarter, the Japanese. Not only that, they were well aware that both the Soviet Union and China attempted to control North Korea as a puppet. Thus, Kim's most vulnerable moment was the August faction incident in 1956, when the pro-Chinese faction boldly attempted to remove Kim Il-sung from power. But he promptly defeated the coup plotters with the loyalty of the battle-hardened men who had been with him since their guerrilla days. Over the next few decades until his death, Kim Il-sung would be fueled by a mindset of constant paranoia, as life events since his days as a guerrilla seemed to have taught him: 1. No one could be trusted except your own blood. 2. Allowing freedom encourages the people to plot against you. And 3. Non-conformers must always be punished severely to serve as an example to others. Soon, Kim and his men would become the totality of the Workers' Party, as they passed their psyches onto their children who would succeed them. One of those children, Kim Jong Un. Chapter 2. Crossing the DMZ. The Kim regime began sending its citizens to life imprisonment in labor camps, or even outright killing them for simple things. Watching the critically acclaimed South Korean TV series Squid Game, for example. This is the result of Kim Il-sung's endemic paranoia and zero-sum mentality passed down to his son Kim Jong-il and his grandchildren Kim Jong Un and Kim Yo-jong. It'd make sense for anyone to escape such a regime. But, of course, the Kims need their population to stay not only to keep their centrally planned economy functional, but also to ensure that a permanent infiltration of viewpoints critical of the Kims does not take hold. The Kims' greatest fear is penetration of any outside influence into their people, especially ideologies from their mortal enemies, South Korea and the United States. And if the people of the country were to subscribe to any outside influence or try to leave, they'd be either jailed, killed, or possibly even have their entire family face the same consequences, with or without them. Despite the risks of escaping North Korea without permission, which is legally considered treason there, why did so many North Korean citizens risk it all? First, South Korea represented what North Korea could have been without the Kims. The Seoul government also began to grant automatic citizenship to North Koreans who managed to find their way into South Korea. But the question is, how would they even escape? We begin with the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ for short. To be accurate, the DMZ refers to the no man's land between the North Korean and South Korean borders. It is about 2.5 miles wide and stretches about 155 miles from one end of the Korean peninsula to the other. This is one of the riskiest areas on the planet, and for all the right reasons. Since Since it sits roughly where the front lines of the opposing sides stopped near the end of the Korean War, it has always been lined with heavily armed troops who man bunkers, underground tunnels, and fortifications from both sides. The DMZ itself is full of mines, barbed wire fences, and large anti-tank barriers in several particular forested areas, making it impossible to cross on foot. Besides, the troops on either side are authorized to shoot at sight at the slightest hint of disturbance. Fortifications, checkpoints, and guard towers with consistent patrols began to be built over the 1970s through to the 1990s in response to several cases of military personnel and North Koreans living near the DMZ defecting. However, it all changed in 2017 when Korean People's Army soldier Oh Chong-song made a snap decision to drive the 4x4 he was in at full speed to break through the road border checkpoint in the DMZ and make a mad dash for the South Korean border. He made his run through the Joint Security Area, which, as the name suggests, is a common meeting ground for contact between the two states. He lost control of the vehicle attempting to cross the line, crashing and losing a wheel. It was at this moment that his fellow KPA soldiers, legally entitled to shoot him dead, had caught up with him. While he took cover behind a tree, 5 shots from the troops' Type 58 assault rifles hit him. It was an attempt that nearly cost him his life. He recounted to the NBC, quote, "I was wearing a padded jacket and the bullet penetrated through here and came out this way. Because of that penetration wound, the muscle there was blown apart and I could feel the warmth of the blood flowing underneath me. I still ran." He was only saved by the timely intervention of a U.S. military medical detachment after his body gave out beneath the South Korean boundary wall, from where he was retrieved by South Korean troops under fire. Since his successful escape, the North Korean side has responded not only by putting up more and more barriers, but also by strengthening the light barrier on their side of the JSA and by installing a robust surveillance network across the DMZ. Since then, only one notable case of a defector crossing through the DMZ into South Korea by dangerously riding the current of the Imjin River in 2019 has been noted. To top it all off, it became apparent in 2024 that the North Korean side had begun to construct a set of walls at several points, including the eastern seawall, to prevent further crossings. Towards China and the East Sea are heavily patrolled by the Korean People's Navy. But a high-profile case of a North Korean family defecting recently does exist. This family was led by a man identified only as Mr. Kim by the BBC. Driven by years of brutal abuse by North Korean authorities and the executions of acquaintances, he made the fateful decision to plan a daring escape with his family. Already living in a fishing village close to South Korean territorial seas in the southwest, Mr. Kim and his brothers took up jobs as civilian fishers for North Korean military personnel. They spent the next 7 months gaining the trust of military personnel on the coast and those who patrol the waters. He learned their movement patterns and schedules, and also mapped out the locations of the sea mines by pretending to go out to look for medicinal herbs. It was on the 6th of May, 2023, that they set sail. At first, sailing slowly to the limit they were allowed, and then continuing past that point. They sailed slowly under the cover of a storm, hoping to pass as floating debris. But after reaching close enough to the South Korean territory of Yongpyong Island, Kim went full speed ahead. North Korean patrol vessels attempted to pursue him, but to no avail. Kim's story is an exception. Very, very few people have managed to escape North Korea by sea prior to Kim. And let's be real, there's no way most people would be able to swim the distance without being caught or drowned. Logically, prospective defectors desperate to escape tend to look north to the country's borders with China and Russia. They just inspire a lot more confidence, because crossing water bodies isn't a simple task and carries the risk of easier detection by the military. Chapter 4. No Northern Sympathies. The regime strictly controls who can live near the DMZ, with violators sentenced to characteristically harsh punishments. Travel and relocation of North Korean citizens within the country are strictly controlled through the country as well, with permissions being required for movement from one province to another. Yet, North Koreans desperate to escape, some of whom are linked to the state itself, had set up broker networks since the 1990s to help them escape under the disguise of commercial vehicles and stealthy movements in the cover of the darkness. Many of those brokers are also composed of ethnic Koreans living in China, and many successful escapees also join their ranks. These movements, mainly taking place through the provinces of Liaoning and Jilin, are often made possible due to lax concern among Chinese border guards. North Korean border guards always had shoot-on-sight orders for those who tried to escape. If they somehow managed to cross into China, the nightmares did not end. These nightmares come in the form of a three-pronged strategy. First, the Chinese government simply considers North Korean escapees to be illegal immigrants. If caught within the local ethnic Korean populations of Liaoning and Jilin or during crossings, they are held by Chinese authorities in detention centers before being shipped right back into North Korea, where a torturous hell on earth awaits them and their families, according to the state's infamous practices of extending punishments to family members. This became more and more frequent after the rise of Kim Jong Un to power, who has done much to improve bilateral relations. We know that 2,000 North Korean refugees were forcibly repatriated between August and September 2023, and through this policy of refoulement, China aids and abets the Kim family regime that is committing crimes against humanity, said Greg Scarlatoiu, executive director of the Washington-based Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Second, brokers may be unreliable without the presence of family connections and relatives in China. Many of the brokers are connected to human trafficking operations which continue to sell countless North Korean women into sexual slavery across China and Southeast Asia. It's also not entirely unheard of for brokers to leave victims penniless, after which the women are forced to seek out marriages just to ensure their safety. Lastly, since the pandemic, the Chinese border has been tightly watched over in combination with severe restrictions on domestic travel. New barriers and surveillance equipment across the Chinese border were also installed, making detection all the more simple. This has had the effect of brokers inflating their fees almost tenfold since the early 2000s. Even then, a $7,000 USD payment proved to not be enough for two defectors to escape detection in China. Touching on the costs of defection, this has continued to represent the biggest obstacle for defection in the planning stage. A 2017 article by Radio Free Asia notes that broker fees ran for $45 in the early 2000s. As the state ramped up its containment efforts, though, the price jumped to at least $1,200 by 2012. They were then reported to be in the $5,000 to $8,000 range by 2016. But with knife-edge tensions between North Korea and the United States in 2017, they ballooned to over $12,000. At this point, it's well above North Korea's estimated GDP per capita of $1,500 to $1,800 at the time, as estimated by the CIA World Factbook. Since the pandemic, costs have gone even further as it has become riskier for brokers, many of whom tend to now be members of the military or administrative officials. Some successful escapees have been noted to pay their brokers in the event of a successful defection to South Korea with a $40,000 adjustment fund provided by the Seoul government. It appears that brokers may charge up to $20,000 USD currently, depending on how far they're being asked to go. The only people who can defect now are the rich and well-connected, added Pastor Stephen Kim from JM Missionary, who helps North Koreans defect through China. And now, about North Korea's other neighbor. Since 2014, Russia also follows the same policy of returning North Korean defectors, most of whom try to make it to Vladivostok. They attempt to cross through the small, 10-plus mile long border between the two countries that runs along the Tumen River. Normally, a direct route from the village of Tumengong to the border town of Kasan is taken for North Korean guest workers who are employed at Vladivostok. This is not much of a better alternative, as this border is arguably more tightly controlled on the Russian side and is no less militarized, despite friendly relations between the two countries these days. Crossing the border using brokers in the same way as one might through China is out of the question. Attempting to cross the river is noticed rather easily, and there is not much of a dense ethnic Korean population composed of Russian citizens to hide among without the Primorsky Krai police not being aware of it. North Korean defectors are also more or less considered to be illegal immigrants and can face forced deportation. One such case of a People's Army military information technology officer, Choi Kum-chol, was allegedly arrested by Russian policemen who broke the door down to capture him in his safe house, located in a rural area outside Vladivostok. Choi Kum-chol escaped his North Korean handlers in Vladivostok, who would normally otherwise be busy maintaining surveillance on the city's North Korean guest workers. Since his arrest, he is said to have more or less disappeared. Kim Jong Un had done much to ensure the cooperation and support of Russian President Vladimir Putin, especially in 2024, as both countries entered into an unprecedented era of cooperation since the fall of the Soviet Union. Suffice it to say, it seems that no North Koreans are going to be able to make it into Russia at all from this point on, except as tightly controlled guest workers or students. Chapter 5: Surveillance Regime. It should be expected that the regime has up-to-date information about the paths that defectors take to try to escape, regardless of whether they try to do it through the seas on the southwestern and southeastern side. Their allies, China and Russia, also help them keep their population locked in by pushing them back from their northern borders. On top of all this, the state is slowly achieving the ability to keep track of its citizens and follow them constantly, no matter where they may be. Kim Jong Un's ascension to the throne has also brought about revolutionary advancements in the use of advanced technology by the regime. The world turned its head in shock and disbelief when China first unveiled its robust facial recognition technology for the surveillance of average citizens in its major cities at the beginning of the 2010s. It wouldn't be long before the technology would be imported by North Korea under the auspices of good relations between Kim Jong Un and Xi Jinping. Starting in the late 2010s, reports started to emerge about surveillance cameras being installed in Pyongyang and border regions. The North Korean regime had already been used to full-spectrum surveillance of telecommunications for decades. This was simply a natural step up for them. New North Korean surveillance systems had their first real test during the early 2020 lockdowns, as authorities tried their best to enforce the regime's harsh movement restrictions, which have been noted as being among the harshest in the world. They were able to particularly control movement out of major population centers and movement at the border. As you can guess, this was taken as an encouragement to ramp the program up even further in 2023 and 2024. An Associated Press article reports the following: North Korea is putting surveillance cameras in schools and workplaces and collecting fingerprints, photographs, and other biometric information from its citizens in a technology-driven push to monitor its population even more closely. It's obvious now that the North Korean state reserves the capability to trace and surveil specific dissidents and defectors through devices and directly through its nascent physical surveillance network. This is a task already made easy by the fact that North Korea only leaves the option of an invasively controlled intranet for most citizens. If a defector is not caught for merely expressing the desire to leave on a digital medium or on the way to the border, the systems installed at the border would be enough to get them. Defectors and their brokers cannot bribe surveillance systems after all, and an alert would lead to guards descending upon them in no time. As mentioned earlier, this omnipresent surveillance system is still in its early stages. North Korea still struggles with the shortcomings of its power generation and supply infrastructure. Nevertheless, it's clear that Kim Jong Un envisions a future in which his long arm can reach the people he oppresses anywhere and at any time. At different points in the history of North Korea, whether it be in the 1990s or the 2000s, there were those that thought it could not get any worse. But such hopes were dashed when the regime tested its first nuclear weapon. Many also held hopes for change after Kim Jong Un rose to power, but he turned out to represent a spitting image of his grandfather's paranoia. With a heavy heart, it must be remarked that yes, it indeed got worse beyond all imagination.